hope most of you get to enjoy the nice sunshine today after the last few windy days. My name is Sean Laham from Self Advocates in Leadership, or SAIL. My visual description is a white middle-aged man with a green sweater on. I have a picture of the SAIL logo and SAIL members in the background. Today's topic is on education and how when kids with intellectual and developmental disabilities receive a quality education, they succeed in life. Just a few reminders today. Please use the Q&A box for any questions you have today. It can be found in the More menu, depending on how you are accessing Zoom. We would prefer you only use the chat today for only the important links and for those that need it for accessibility reasons. We again prefer you use the Q&A for questions, and we encourage you to avoid long discussions in the chat because they can be distracting. We will be taking a few questions during the program, but due to time we may not get to everybody. If you stay after the main program ends, some of us stay to answer more questions. We also need you to click on the globe icon today in Zoom and select if you want to hear today's program in English or Spanish, as this will help with our interpretation services. And then lastly, we want to encourage all of our speakers today to speak slower so that our interpretation services correctly relays your words. With that, I will pass it to my two co-MCs today to introduce themselves. Starting with Eric.
Well, thank you, Sean. My name is Eric Mathis. He, him, his is my pronouns. I'm wearing a black jacket that feels good and glasses, and I have a smile, and I would like to introduce Emily to go next.
Emily, are you there? She might be busy for the minute, so
Well,
I will move on to the next thing.
And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to the ARC of King County Director of Public Policy and Civic Engagement, Ramona Haddendorf. She will be giving us an overview of today's topic.
Hello, everyone. Let me get my computer set up. I actually have some slides for you today. Do I have the right one? Yeah, okay. Okay, all right. Do you all see the inclusive education PowerPoint?
yes.
All right, awesome. Okay, so my name is Ramona Haddendorf. As Sean just said, I'm the Director of Public Policy and Civic Engagement at the ARC of King County. And I am sorry, I'm really faded today. I tried fixing my lighting, but my image is there's a white background. My hair basically looks white and my face looks really white. And I've got a really dark shirt on and I got dark eyes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about inclusive education. This is just, we're not going to go into the weeds. This is just an overview. I just wanted to share some of the terms that you might use and some basic definitions to help ground you and what we're talking about when we're talking about inclusive education. And I'm really excited because today we have some really great guests who can go into more about kind of the work that they're doing. But this is just an overview. So inclusive education, what's needed to make sure all kids get one? So first of all, public education, it needs to work for all students. And that's not just a moral statement or an aspirational statement, that's actually a legal statement. It needs to work for all students. Special education services ensure access to education. And I make that point because for a lot of people with IDD, they're cut off from the general education. And special education, instead of being services to help connect them to general education, they almost become a separate space. Or they do become, not almost, they do absolutely become a separate space. And it's actually not supposed to work that way. So services are a way to get education. They're accessibility tool. So inclusive education supports students learning together. So not necessarily going into a segregated or self-contained classroom, but being together in the same space. Inclusive education, it anticipates that kids come with diverse needs. It's like this includes kids with disabilities, but other types, like maybe they're learning English. I mean, other types of diversity. It's accessible. So it really thinks about what do we need to be proactively accessible, and it's responsive to the students who are there and what they need. The term presumed competence. This is actually really key to making sure that all kids get a good education. And that's the assumption that everyone has capacity to learn, to think, and understand regardless of disability or diagnosis. And the reason why this one is so important is because sometimes people have bias and they don't assume that. In fact, they assume that because you have a certain type of disability or because maybe you're non-speaking, that you can't learn or you're limited in what you can learn. And we see how that plays out in our kids' life. So presumed competence is a really important concept in inclusive learning. Now, inclusive learning, as I said in the beginning, it's aspirational, but there's some legal teeth to this. So if you are a student with a disability or you are a parent of a child with a disability, there's some basic rights attached to disability. These are basic disability rights. There's an equal opportunity to benefit. There's an equal opportunity to participate. Schools cannot deny access to students with disabilities, and they can't require them to be educated separately just because they have a disability. And individualized does not mean that services need to be provided in a segregated setting. So now a few key laws that are behind these rights I just shared. So you have what's called IDEA, and that is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And that spells out the rules for special education services. IDEA, I like to think of it as a grant bill. Essentially, the government says, we're going to give you money, and then you have to do things this way. And if you don't do things this way, then you don't get your money. So that's IDEA. But there's two other laws that are really critically important to students with disabilities. And by the way, these laws also govern all local and state services and federal services. So you have Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and that's kind of behind the equal access concept. And that one came out saying that if you get federal funds, you have to make sure you're not discriminating against people because they have a disability. So then in 1990, we got the Americans with Disability Act. And this expanded on that. It expanded the concept into some private settings. And there's different rules depending on the setting, and it has different titles, and some deal just with employment or maybe transportation. But Title II is really important for schools and all government services because Title II says to state and to local government that you can't discriminate against kids with disabilities. You have to offer an equal opportunity to benefit. And so this is just core. So even if you just take IDEA off the table for a second, just with these civil rights legislation bills, you have some fundamental rights to access an opportunity to education. So together, these three bills give you a legal framework. So you've got the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and that's what sets up special education services, and that's what sets out the rules and the framework for delivery of those services. But fundamentally, those services are about access to education. And these other two bills are saying you have to give kids an equal opportunity to this education. Like you can't have, you're going to give all kids an education, but not these kids an education because they have a disability. That's what these three bills collectively say you can't do. And there's also aspects of these bills, I won't go into the details, that basically you're supposed to start with the concept of the most integrated setting appropriate. So assuming that if they didn't have a disability, what kind of education would they get? That's where you start with. You don't start with they need to be somewhere else because they have a disability. You start with, okay, what do we do to make sure they get what they need? And then inclusion comes in with well, then how do we adjust our education to make sure that it's accessible, that kids can actually get it? So rather than just saying, oh, sorry, what we're doing doesn't work for you, you have to go somewhere else, it's really, there's a legal challenge that says, well, maybe you should rethink what you're doing so that it works better for everyone and it doesn't discriminate against them because they have a disability. So this is the legal foundation for inclusive. There's also a research basis. We do whole classes on this, so we won't go into it, but I'll just summarize by saying that there is decades of research that shows inclusion actually has a lot better outcomes for students with disabilities. It also has really good outcomes for students without disabilities. And I don't know why. There's a lot of different things to say, there's this, there's that. And I think there's a lot of different things. It probably depends on the student. Maybe they feel isolated within the school. If you don't have a sense of belonging, if you don't have that security, that's going to affect your ability to learn. They may not have access to core curriculum or certain subjects. Like we hear all the time, like I didn't get civics education, I didn't get my sexual health education. So sometimes there's aspects of the curriculum that because they're in a segregated room that they don't actually get a whole lot of that curriculum, or that curriculum wasn't adapted in a way that was accessible to them. It could be that they were denied opportunities because of low expectations. Maybe somebody thought, well, they're not going to get anything out of that study of this book, so we're not going to, expose them to it. So there could be a lot of different things that are happening. But what we do know is that students without and with disabilities, they do better academically and socially when they learn together in classrooms that are designed to be inclusive. And I really want to emphasize designed to be inclusive because I think a lot of us are afraid, or maybe we have our own lived experience of it wasn't necessarily designed to be inclusive. People were just thrown in together and they kind of had, it was kind of like sink or swim. Um, and that might be integrated, but that's not inclusive. Inclusive is something that's really thought out about how can we make sure, again, that this environment is accessible? How are we making sure that we're responsive to the students and what they need? How are we being inclusive? So it's not just integration, it's really being thoughtful. Um, and then there's sort of a universal lesson that when you design things to be accessible and responsive, everyone benefits. And this is a concept that goes across all things. We see this in our built environment. We see this in education. We see this in a lot of different areas that, when you design things to be maximally accessible to most people, and you're really thinking, a lot of times people who don't even have that disability or that concern that you're designing for, they benefit from it. And maybe they don't need it all the time, but when they have it, when they need it, it's really beneficial. Like, for instance, elevators. Some people with disabilities would have completely inaccess to certain parts of a building if they didn't have an elevator. People without disabilities also like to have an elevator. They may not need it most of the time. Maybe sometimes they prefer to take the stairs because you get some exercise going up and down stairs. But there's going to be days like, say they have a stroller, they have a baby in a stroller, say they have 6 bags of groceries with them. There are times when everybody needs an elevator. And so that's kind of the same concept with education, is that even when you're designing for a specific population, when you're accessible like that, everyone else can benefit because we all need a little extra something. We all need a little bit of extra access support at different points in our lives or different points in our day. So inclusionary practices are strategies that teachers use to ensure learning is accessible and responsive. And I'm really happy because for years we used to point out about how low our inclusion rates were and our bad, they call it least restricted environment, and we still have a long ways to go. But we've done so much work over the last 5 or so years. And we now have something called the Inclusionary Practices Technical Network. And this is a group of professionals who really worked to make sure that inclusion and that resources for inclusion are available so that schools can implement it. And there's a lot of really exciting work going on. They call it the IPTN, and that stands for Inclusionary Practices Technical Network. And now there's this new term, and a lot of people do not know this term at all. It's called MTSS, and that stands for Multi-Tiered System of Support. That's just a framework. And teachers use it to identify what students need. It helps educators organize their efforts, and teachers can use it to identify who needs additional support and what support is needed. And they organize it into tiers. So tier 1 is the universal core instruction for all students. Tier 2 is a targeted support. Tier 3 could be more intensive or individualized support. And when used to support inclusion, the process can be used by teachers to improve tier 1 so it's more accessible and responsive. So say they have a lot of students say like they used to be, a certain type of community that had a lot of English speakers, and say now 50% of their students are not native English teachers. Well, that might prompt a change in how you do that tier 1, because now you got a lot of English learners in your school. So it's just a way of assessing. It's like, well, what do we need? What do all kids need? What's going to benefit everyone? And then making sure that the people, you try to get everyone in that foundation, but some people need some targeted. This can be used in exclusionary ways also. A school might say, like, if you're tier 3, automatically you're off in special education, you're somewhere else, but that's not really the way. Hopefully it's being used. And it can also be a very powerful tool to use it for inclusion instead. So MTSS is a new thing that a lot of parents might hear. And also, I want to emphasize that inclusion, it gets back to that really thinking about it. It doesn't just happen. It's not integration. It's not just throwing people together. It's a choice. Schools decide to be inclusive. Classrooms decide to be inclusive. Communities decide to be inclusive. And it relies on that concept we talked about earlier, presumed competence. We all have potential. We're all capable of learning things. So it relies on presumed competence. And it also relies on a willingness to adjust practices or strategies. And maybe the way you were trying it doesn't work. And maybe you need to try something different. Maybe the makeup of your student body is shifting and you need to do something different. Maybe mostly what you're doing is pretty good, but you need to be willing to push in certain types of support because there's a few students who need that individualized support. So that was just the overview of some of these concepts around inclusive learning. And so this legislative session, and we'll learn more today, got just a few key questions like, how are we funding schools to ensure students get the services that they need? And right now we have legislators are considering proposals to increase funding for special education services, and they include early supports for infants and toddlers. So this is the 0 to 3 program. It's not part of schools, but it's part of the spectrum under IDEA. We have services in preschool. Special education services actually start at age 3. We have services in K-12. And then we also have the transition school to work services. Not all students get access to this, but some students do. And these are students who continue on after the traditional senior year. And it's not always school to work services, but that's a real common one that we see, especially here in King County, in my county. And all of these are critical, by the way. And right now, we've got bills that address all of these. Some of them are like the transition school to work to 22, that's a separate bill. But the other ones are all addressed in some bills. And we want to make sure that all of those are funded. And we don't know yet what's going to be funded, but we want all of them to be funded because they're all really important. It's the spectrum. Another big question is, how are we ensuring schools provide equal access and opportunity? We've done a lot, as I said earlier, with this IPTN, this technical assistance. There's a legal foundation for inclusion. There's a strong research foundation for inclusion, but ultimately it's still up to the local schools to decide that, yeah, we're going to embrace inclusion and we're going to make it happen. And sometimes that's frustrating for people because they're like, I want inclusion, but my school's not doing it. So how are we ensuring, like, what are we doing to prompt that? And right now, what we do is the state has promoting and supporting inclusionary practices for several years. So we have the support there. So if school says, I don't know how to do it, guess what? There's some tools for you. Also, just so you know, this IPTN, this year they're targeting specifically two populations. One is all Black students who use special education services, and they're targeting that because they're finding that a lot of times they might be over-identified, or they might be put into segregated settings more often than students without disabilities. And then they're also targeting our population, students with intellectual and developmental disabilities, because we are put in the segregated settings most often. And that's something like they've done a lot of work to get more people in the general education environment, but they're finding kids with IDD, they're still being put into segregated environments. So it's really pushing schools to think about, okay, inclusion means all of us. You know, back going to the legal foundation, you can't decide that these students have to be separate. You know, you need to make sure your education is working for everyone. There's two funding proposals that would include a way to keep paying for technical assistance and oversight. It's and also inclusionary practices could be something they use the money for. We don't know if those will survive the budget session, but right now, two of the bills have like a set aside pot of money for OSBI to continue this work. So they wouldn't have to have a line item every year that inclusionary practices can continue this year. It would be like ongoing funding that they could use. There's also, and you'll hear about later, something called a statewide IEP. There's some tools to think about, like how do we support our schools and the individuals in our IEP teams to really think about inclusion, really make it happen for kids. So that's an idea out there. Again, it's not like a mandate, like you have to do this, but it's more like we're going to make sure you understand how you can do it, and we want to make sure you have the support to do it. That's the approach the state is taking. And then there are ongoing advocacy efforts to improve student experiences. And these are some real specific things. There's recording IEP meetings. You're going to hear later on why some advocates really want to see this happen. And by that, this is usually in the sense of recording for the parents, so they have access to it later. And they can, well, you'll hear later why people might want this. And then improving the evaluation process. I know it doesn't look like this bill is advancing this year, but someone else you'll be hearing from later, Representative Paulette. He's one of the Seattle legislators. He's been working on trying to get the evaluation process working better for all kids, especially with that initial one when parents think something's wrong and they're requesting for an evaluation. And then reducing restraint and isolation. This is not necessarily a special education thing, but it happens mostly to kids with disabilities. It happens mostly to kids with disabilities who are in these segregated settings. So it's not special education, but a lot of us who advocate in the space of kids with disabilities, this is something we advocate on because it affects mostly young kids with disabilities. And mostly it's kids also who might be in foster care, who might be homeless, who have a lot of trauma in their life. And it's also disproportionately, you're more likely if you're a Black African American, you're more likely to also experience restraint and isolation. There is a bill. It cleared its policy committee. We don't know if it's going to clear fiscal. Hasn't been scheduled yet. So we don't know what's going to happen with that. Last year, the bill didn't pass, but there was a good pot of money that was set aside to invest in this. And then the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, it's a big, long name of an agency, but they oversee schools. They set up a demonstration pilot and project sites. What is it called? Well, I can't think of it. Reduce isolation, reduce restraint, eliminate isolation project. That's the name of the project. But we don't know if they're going to have money to continue that. So that's something else that advocates are working on. They want to make sure that that work can continue. They've had some really good results, and somebody will be sharing about what that looks like. And this is working with schools so they understand what they can do instead of relying on restraint or isolation. And then finally, I'm done with what I'm going to say, but these are some links for you. While other people are talking, I'll put them into the chat. So if you want something immediate, these are all state resources. I really want to give a shout out to OSBI. That's the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, because like 6-7 years ago, we were just like shouting into the void that this kind of thing is important. And now we actually have a partnership with the state saying, yeah, we think this is important. And so one looks at what is this IPTN? There's a lot of resources on there. One is about the ending isolation. So that's that project that they set up. What kind of work are they doing there? There's also a really great toolkit that just came out a few months ago called Comprehensive Inclusive Education. And this is something for IEP teams and parents that you can use and consult to really come up with an inclusive IEP for your child. And then there's also a great tool called Myths and Facts. And this is really good because some people, again, have some really preconceived ideas about what inclusion is or isn't. Is it more expensive? Is it hard to do? And this really goes in and it says, okay, this is what the truth is, and has a lot of really good resources in there and some source material. So for those of you who want your school to be inclusive, these are really good tools to share. And it's backed up by the state to say it's not just me. This is like a real thing, because sometimes that's what's hard when you're an advocate. It feels like you're shouting into the void and you really need that backup from people who are considered experts. So thank you for being here. And I am done now. I will mute.
Thank you so much for all the and a lot of really information and yeah, thank you for that. I'm gonna now do over.
Next, it's my honor to introduce Cassie Martin, the Executive Director of Special Education at the Washington Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, who will be discussing the Individualized Education Program and the tool's inclusionary practices.
Awesome, Shelby.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Let me see. Let me know if I am sharing, if you're seeing, are you seeing my notes or are you seeing, am I showing my notes or am I showing the slides?
We see both right now, Dr. Martin.
Okay. Let's see. I can just, that's not working. Okay, let me just try it this way. Okay, here we go. Thanks for your patience. Okay. So good morning, everyone. My name is Cassie. I use she, her pronouns. I have long, dark blonde, curly hair. I'm wearing glasses, a bright pink shirt, and a blazer. And I am the Executive Director of Special Education at the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. And I have had the honor of designing the Inclusionary Practices Technical Assistance Network that Ramona was just speaking about. So thank you so much for having me today. Ramona touched on this a little bit, but I just wanted to be clear that about 6 years ago, Washington State was rated one of the least inclusive states in our nation. So it was in the top 10 of the least inclusive. And we weren't comfortable with that. So what that meant was that the majority of students with IEPs in Washington State were not spending their time in general education classrooms. They're spending their time in separate educational classrooms, or as Ramona referred to them, in segregated settings. And Ramona talked about the years and years and years, decades, so about 80 years of research that we have that tells us that students with disabilities have better outcomes when they learn in general education, and specifically in those intentionally designed inclusive general education classrooms. So over the course of the last 6 years, when we've really put these efforts behind inclusive education and students having access to general education environments, what we've seen is that now we have more than 22,000 students in Washington State that used to be learning only 0 to 39% of the time in general education, now accessing general education for 80 to 100% of their school day. So almost all of the school day in general education. So this has been really exciting for us because it shows some great progress. But I'm going to tell you why, as Ramona said, that these improvement efforts aren't over and why we're shifting our attention to specific student groups that continue to not have access to general education and all the choice and opportunity that's provided throughout their schools. So what we've really been working to do is reframe the way that we're thinking about educating students with disabilities. And for those of you who have been watching the news, there's been a lot of talk about this lately. There was a medical model that has been introduced and historically used where disability was viewed as a deficiency, and that interventions were focused on making people seem less disabled and fitting into this norm. That there was a belief that students with disabilities could not be included in core content, so grade level core content, which is what is learned in general education classrooms. And there's been a reframing based on what we've learned from all of the research, from reports from individuals with disabilities, from educators, from families, from experts, that we know that differences are experienced by everyone. And as our public schools across Washington state prepare to teach our students, we need to prepare to teach each and every one of our students in general education classrooms, knowing that that provides better outcomes for all of our students. That again, interventions are designed. So when we're talking about interventions, you heard Ramona talk about a multi-tiered system of support in tier 2 and tier 3, which are different levels of intervention that we can provide for individuals, that they're designed to help people access and interact with the community. They're not supposed to be used to normalize someone. It's to celebrate every student's strengths and then help provide some of the resources that are needed. And I want to be clear, these aren't just the resources that are needed in terms of the way that a student shows up in the classroom. It's the way that we design classrooms so they're ready for every single student that shows up at school every single day. Our goal is that when every student in Washington state shows up for school, that they walk into their school building, they walk into their general education classroom, they walk into their physical education class, they walk into their art class, they walk into their class on community living, that is a general education class, and they think, wow, this class was created with me in mind. I see myself represented in this classroom. And we know that learning environments, those are what need to adapt and change to make sure that they are available, accessible, and representative of every single student. And again, that the interventions that we're providing are really focused on the strengths of the individual, that we're really taking a strength-based approach, and that we know that what's most important is that what we're doing is we're transforming the culture of our schools, so that this isn't just something that we're saying, okay, inclusion for some. As Ramona said before, we're really thinking about, we know that we have all different kinds of learners that enter our school spaces and our classrooms every single day. How are we making sure that as large school communities, as districts, as a state, that we are changing our culture to make sure that we have universal supports in place and then interventions in place so every single student is getting what they need? And we know that there's certain structures and systems that need to be in place to make that happen. And we also know that this is a journey and not a destination. And the reason why I bring that up is because we're at our Advocacy Day today, and we can't just say, okay, we funded inclusion for 1 year, check, we've done all the work. We know that this is a long-term commitment and sustained work. And as Ramona said, our populations are going to continue to shift and change. The people that enter our schools are going to shift and change. The needs of our communities are going to shift and change. And so we need to be responsible and shift and change along with the needs of those communities to continue to be inclusive for everyone. One of the things I say when I talk about inclusive education is that it's inherently collaborative. And what that means is that we can't be successful in including all learners in general education or across our school communities if we're not working together. These are true partnerships. So again, what we're trying to do at the state level and what we're working on our districts doing, and what we're working on seeing in our school buildings and classrooms is that people are collaborating and working together in order to provide inclusive education. It's not the role of one person, it's the role of every single one of us. It's not up to special educators, it's not up to just general educators, it's also up to principals, it's up to district staff, and not just a special education director, but also the director of teaching and learning, our superintendents, our school board members, our advocates, our students, our families. Again, all of us really working towards this common goal of creating schools where everyone belongs. So, and this is something also that Ramona touched on, we were really excited when we saw our data, around 22,000 students having access to more general education. But what we started noticing when we were digging into our statewide data is there are certain students that are not receiving these opportunities. We know that Black students with disabilities have been and continue to be segregated and disciplined, and back to Ramona's point, also restrained and isolated at higher rates than all other student groups. We also know that students with intellectual and developmental and behavioral disabilities continue to be segregated for all or most of the school day. This means that the large number in Washington state of students with intellectual and developmental disabilities do not have access to general education, and we know that from our statewide data. And then over 2/3 of preschool students, so these are our youngest students that are entering our school system with disabilities, are served in separate early childhood settings. And what we also know from our data is that those beginnings in separate placements reinforce separate educational placements throughout the course of a student's educational journey, and we don't want that to happen. So we created this Inclusionary Practices Technical Assistance Network. And basically what that is a large coordinated community that's providing support to districts, schools, and families across Washington state. And that is made up of a whole bunch of different professionals and family members and individuals with lived experiences that are guiding and implementing this work to support schools and districts. Because we're operating off of this hypothesis, or what we believe to be true, which is that if we improve professional development, so the training and the resources that we're providing, and if we really work together intentionally, so really think about why we're working together, what outcomes we want to reach, that we can better include student populations that continue to be excluded. So those are our Black students with disabilities and our students with intellectual and developmental disabilities, we know continue to be educated in separate settings. And what we also know is, back to what Ramona said earlier, when we do this, that we're going to see improvement in student inclusion and student experiences across all school systems, again, for all students. And so we have an aim statement, which I'll talk about in a minute. But again, as I mentioned before, this network is aimed to operate as a collaborative, coordinated unit. Everyone has a role. So if you're interested in the network, Ramona provided the our website. You can always reach out directly to me. And what we're less interested in right now is how busy are we? How many schools and districts are we interacting with? How many inclusionary practices are we implementing? What we really want to focus on is how effective are we? How are students and families letting us know that their educational experiences are better and that there's better outcomes? That we have post-school data that show that there's more choice and opportunity for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So again, just to provide a visual, about 5 out of 10 Black students with disabilities spend at least 80% of the school day in a general education setting. And that's in comparison to 7 out of 10 of white students with disabilities that spend 80% or more of their school day in general education settings. And this visual shows, it has people across the screen and a few shaded in, that about 3 of 100 students with intellectual or developmental disabilities spend at least 80% of the school day in a general education setting. And the majority of those, so if you see the 3 out of 100, what that means is that other 97 students, the majority of them are spending their time, the majority of their day in a separate educational setting where we have research and information that shows that there are not as strong educational outcomes and feelings of community and access to research-based instruction when they're spending time in those settings. So this is a big problem, and this is what we're trying to address. So this is our aim statement. So when we think about this large network, how we're working together, what we're really trying to do is provide high quality support and professional development and resources to disrupt these separate systems that disproportionately affect Black students with disabilities and students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We see from those numbers that Black students with disabilities and students with intellectual and developmental disabilities are spending more time in separate settings, and that's resulting in not as good educational outcomes. And just from a civil rights perspective, Ramona talked about some of those rights to a free and appropriate public education and a civil right to learn in a least restrictive environment. That isn't necessarily happening for these two groups. And what we believe is if we follow the path of students with intellectual and developmental disabilities and Black students with disabilities, we let them lead the way to design our general education settings, that is going to make our schools better for every single student in Washington State. And again, just reiterating how everyone has a role. We have like colleges and universities supporting us. We have teacher associations. We have family and community advocacy organizations supporting this work, professional development organizations, and content experts. We want everyone to be able to see themselves in this statewide network. And I hope that you can consider a way that you can also be involved. And so just to kind of show a little bit about how we're organized, we have our members, and those are the folks that are providing support directly to our districts and schools. We have an advisory, which is a committee that is offering us guidance, and that includes experts, individuals with lived experiences, higher ed students, school board members, folks that can let us know kind of what are some other questions that we need to dig into to make Washington schools more inclusive. And then we have our partner districts. So these are school districts across Washington that we are working with, who we've identified that students with intellectual and developmental disabilities are being educated more in separate settings across preschool all the way up through elementary school and secondary school, and we're trying to support them to rethink their systems and structures to be more inclusive. And then we have collaborators, which are folks that interact with us to help, again, support us and to collaborate with us to make the services and technical assistance that we're providing even better. So when I talk about the Inclusionary Practices Technical Assistance Network and this statewide IEP, which I'm going to talk about, which is an individual education program. The reason I'm talking about these two today is part of our legislative acts. We call these improvement efforts. So these are areas that we know we need to get better in Washington State. We just know, we know it. We have the research that shows it. We've gotten feedback from our community, and they're letting us know these are areas that we need to do better. And so currently in Washington State, for a statewide individual education program, schools use multiple systems to develop and maintain these programs. And what happens is that means that there are both inefficiencies in terms of when students transfer from district to district, when we're uploading information, in terms of the training and technical assistance that we provide, it can be really inconsistent. And what happens is a lot of the time it loses the original vision of an individual education program. The idea of an individual education program is it's supposed to provide specially designed instruction and additional support for students with disabilities to make progress in the general education curriculum. And it's supposed to be individualized and used as an instructional tool. And what we've noticed is that currently it's not being used as an instructional tool as it was originally intended. So what we're trying to do is access funds, so money, to provide a more unified platform for educators and families. And I'll talk about what the specific what the specific characteristics are that we're looking for that ensures greater accessibility, make sure that we're kind of following the law. There are certain things that we have to do as part of the IEP that's written in IDEA, and make sure that really they're being used effectively to support students across our system. So we have some benefits for a statewide IEP system, and I want to be clear that this is an IEP platform across our state. Each IEP will still be individualized. So it's still an individualized, that is the cornerstone of IDEA, is that these supports and structures are individualized to support students. But we do know that there are improvements, again, that need to be made. So IEPs are really focused on improving student outcomes and are an instructional tool. So what we're trying to do is build in some safeguards so people aren't spending a lot of time focusing on, are we following the law? Are we not? That's already built into the statewide IEP system. We recognize that IEPs currently aren't very accessible to students and families. So creating some sort of a parent portal that would allow families to track student progress and stay informed. So it wouldn't just be receiving the IEP through there, but also being able to see and track the progress that students making, so there can be more conversation and shared ownership over the IEP. We want to make sure that there are interpretation and translation services that better support students and families in the IEP. And that there's ongoing professional development that's built into the IEP to support educators and service providers so they know whether or not they're doing things well. So if I can see that a student's not making progress, are there embedded professional development tools that can say, what can I do differently as the educator and as a service provider to support students to make better progress? So there's something that's happening on my end instructionally that's not working right now. So what do we need to do to change in order to make more progress? And also that, again, there would be that real-time data. So students and families could see ongoing. It wouldn't just be this 1 year long annual report. And when you receive those quarterly progress reports, be able to identify sooner whether or not the instruction and the resources that we're providing are really making a difference for students to access and make progress in the general education core content. And I just wanted to end today by saying that all of these improvement efforts, Ramona started by talking about educational equity, is really to make sure that that we are focused on making sure that the resources and the systems and structures that we're providing are equitable and that everyone has access to those resources and to a high quality education. And in addition to that, that we have opportunities to co-design and create spaces for students, for families, and for community representatives to partner with us to let us know their experiences and what's happening. Again, as a state representative, I don't know all of the things. I'm informed by the people that I interact with, by the information that I collect, and that's always shifting and changing based on the information that's provided to me. So we are really interested in being as responsive as possible and making sure that we are using information in order to drive these changes in our state to make things better for all students. So that's some about the inclusionary practices, technical assistance network, and the statewide IEP. And I just wanted to thank all of you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you all today. So thank you.
This is all that I ever read about. I'm really thank you for coming today.
Up next, it's my privilege to introduce Christina Mendieta from Kindering, who will be speaking about early supports for kids.
Well, thank you, Sean. I would say that it is my privilege to get to present. And I know we're a little bit behind time, so I'll do my best to make up for it without rushing too much. First and foremost, can everyone see my presentation? Thumbs up? Yes. Okay, great. Perfect. Well, very nice to see all of you today. My name is Christina Mendieta. I'm the Director of Public Affairs at Kindering. Quick visual description. I am a millennial with straight brown hair, or I'm a white woman, And today I have decided to put my hair in a braid over my shoulder. And today I will be focused on one policy priority, and it is Kindering's policy priority, which is, once again, early supports for infants and toddlers. So first, a little background on the organization I'm here representing, Kindering. Kindering is the largest early support for infants and toddlers provider in the state. We're also a neurodevelopmental center of excellence, and that's not me bragging about us, that's a state designation. We provide a comprehensive suite of services, but our largest service or largest program is early supports. We also fit into a much larger picture. Kindering is definitely not the only ESIT provider in the state. We are one of many, and there are many that are similar size to us all over the state. And for those who aren't familiar, ESIT services, which again is short for early supports for infants and toddlers, it's those one-on-one individualized services, usually pediatric therapies delivered in the home for kids 0 to 3 years old with developmental delays and disabilities. So these are things like occupational therapy, physical therapy, feeding therapy, and there are others as well, but those are our most popular. So what's our goal this year? Well, it's quite similar to previous years. So if you have been part of that effort, thank you, and you'll be familiar. We want to make sure that the state is funding the full continuum of special education. And that's also why it's such a privilege to be here and to hear from folks who are so familiar with and knowledgeable about the K through 12 special ed system. Our goal, and we have been very clear with legislators since we started working on this, is that we are not in competition with the K through 12 special ed system. We are strengthening it. So let me just get really wonky really quickly. So our 2025 legislative priority is to correct an unintended consequence of legislative action that occurred in 2020. So the short of it is that in the special education funding formula, which you may be familiar, is broken into 3 parts based on age. So there's the 0 to 3-year-old special education multiplier, the 3 to 5-year-old special education multiplier, and then the 5 to 22-year-old now special education multiplier. It used to be the case that the 0 to 3-year-old special ed multiplier and the 3 to 5 special ed multiplier were exactly the same. And in 2020, when the state legislature moved ESIT services out of OSPI's chapter of state law into DCYF's, those 2 multipliers became delinked. There were almost no other changes, by the way. This really the goal was just to transfer the ESIT program from OSPI, the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, over to DCYF, the Department of Children, Youth, and Families. But one thing that folks didn't notice, I think, and this is from talking to advocates at the time as well as policymakers, is that those 2 multipliers became delinked. Nobody really thought it was an issue because at that time, the 0 to 3-year-old special ed multiplier and the 3 to 5-year-old special ed multiplier were both 1.15. However, when the rest of the special ed system continued to get special education multiplier boosts, unfortunately, the 0 to 3-year-old system got left behind. ESIT got left behind. And unfortunately, it's really the youngest kids with developmental delays and disabilities who pay the price when services decline. And we have been hearing from ESIT service providers throughout the state for a couple of years now how difficult the financial picture is. And that is also true at Kindering. We are struggling. And as I said, at the end of the day, it's kids and families who pay the price when services decline. So just a little bit more wonky background. So ESIT is primarily funded through state special ed dollars. And as I mentioned, it has its own multiplier. And if you can see the screen, this screenshot is from RCW. And it's actually the section for appropriations for special education programs. And so you can see this is right before that statutory move happened in 2020. So this is 2019 law. And it says a district's annual average head count enrollment of students ages birth through 4 and those 5 years old not yet enrolled in kindergarten who are eligible for and receiving special education et cetera, et cetera, multiplied by 1.15. Why do I include this super wonky special ed funding formula background? It's to show that, that we're not exaggerating at all when we say that ESIT, the 0 to 3-year-old special ed multiplier, was the same as the 3 to 5-year-old special ed multiplier, and that it was considered receiving special education. So our vision, this is sort of a visual, sort of simplifying the situation. We just want to make sure that that first stage of services is well funded, so that we're supporting the youngest kids with developmental delays and disabilities. That is not to say that the pre-K 3 to 5-year-old system, or even the rest of the special ed system, is adequately funded. We know that it is not. So we're very lucky to have a wonderful set of supporters, including lots of you in this room. We have made it to the support agenda of the ARC, Bright Spark, Children's Alliance, and then we are the top priority of ECDA, which is the Early Childhood Development Association of Washington, of course, Kindering, Northwest Center People of All Abilities, and the Whatcom Center for Early Learning. So if you all are part of any of those organizations, thank you for like really many years of advocacy. So why do we care so much about this seemingly technical issue? Why do we care so much about relinking the 0 to 3-year-old special education multiplier to the 3 to 5-year-old special education multiplier? It's because ESIT is so important, both in terms of outcomes for kids, which is obviously our main priority, but also in terms of the state budget, which is becoming increasingly important this year, and I think for several years to come. So as many of you know, the 0 to 3-year-old age range is a really unique window of opportunity for neurodevelopment, because about 85% of brain growth happens in that time period. Early supports can help children achieve important developmental milestones, which can also sort of empower them throughout their lives. And for us at Kindering, that is the #1 most important piece of it. Part of our argument, though, to policymakers who have to balance the state budget is the sort of fiscal logic behind investing early. So statewide in Washington State, about 40% of kids who exit ESIT services around age 3 no longer need additional special education services, which obviously saves the state millions of dollars in special education funding each year. And then that fact is sort of aligned with national research, which shows that for every $1 society spends on these types of programs, society gets back about $17. And that is related to the savings for things like reduced need for additional special education, improved high school graduation rates, increased job income, et cetera. So it is a good investment. And I keep sort of making that argument right now, because I think we all know that we are facing a huge, gaping, potentially $12 billion budget hole. And so it's really important to make the case to policymakers that, yes, this is a wise investment. Yes, it saves money later down the line. And my other piece of this is I am worried that if we don't fix this now, it is only going to become more difficult, because it's going to seem more acceptable for that first stage, that 0 to 3-year-old stage, and the 3 to 5-year-old stage to be on separate levels. And as the rest of the special ed system continues to get a boost, because I'm sure they will, as they should, then that the distance between those two is only going to become greater, and therefore more difficult to bridge. So let's talk legislative strategy this year. So I'm really happy to see that even in this difficult budget year, there are many special education bills that have been submitted. One of which is Senate Bill 5263 by Senator Peterson. So this bill has ESIT included right now, and it just has very simple language that would just relink that 0 to 3-year-old multiplier to the 3 to 5-year-old multiplier. And I am delighted that it has surpassed the policy committee cutoff, and it is scheduled for executive session on Friday. I am also delighted that HB 1310 is scheduled for executive session out of appropriations on Friday. And we dare to dream that there's an opportunity to amend that bill. Potentially, this is by Representative Paulette, who I see is here. Yes, could potentially include ESIT as well. And so we're basically working every possible angle. And our sort of message is that we understand that these bills are going to change drastically over the legislative session. And so right
Christina?
now, the bills have increased 3 to 5 year old multipliers. And so our ask only.
Christina?
Yep.
I hate to interrupt you, but you mentioned Representative Paulette is here. It's time slot. So I'm gonna, we always give our legislators the floor when they
I'm on
come.
my last slide, so it's perfect timing. I'm happy to see to Representative Paulette. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Paulette, welcome.
Hi, do you want me to jump in?
Go right on in. I think they'll give you an introduction here in a second.
Yeah, Emily, are you ready?
Oh, hello, Representative Paulette. We're so happy you're able to join us today. Thank you for coming on this very important day about education. Please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Emily, and welcome to everyone. Thank you for asking me to participate. There are, I think a lot of things to be extremely concerned about for the disability community and self-advocates and those who care right now. Our state is in bad shape in terms of a deficit, which is going to affect our ability to deliver services that we said we were going to improve on services, and it's making it difficult to do what we need to do on special education. And at the same time, we are scared with the news every day from the federal government and its commitment to ensuring the civil rights of everyone with disabilities in the educational system. Not to mention, the fright over cuts in Medicaid, excuse me, and so many other services and federal employees that we rely on. So I know that one of the items right before me was recording of IEPs, which I had seen on the agenda Yana was going to be discussing. And I think that bill kind of gives a story of this legislative session. Recording of IEPs is something that this was in a bill by Representative Walsh. It's been in an aspect and part of the legislation I introduced last year and reintroduced this year on improving evaluations for students with disabilities for individual education plans. It was part of a bill from Representative Couture as well. So there's broad support for the need to record IEP meetings for parents with disabilities and guardians, as well as accuracy, as well as for those with limited English proficiency. And for the students, as Yana is putting up. And yet the bill didn't move. And in part, that was because almost anything that had a dollar sign on it that came to the Education Committee was really simply never going to move forward this year. And that is a shame because many of these things are just totally integrated with the need for improving special education and funding, and our state's legislative leadership and new governor and the outgoing governor all said, this is the year we're going to have to step up to the plate and swing hard for special education funding And that includes everything you've been talking about. And yet, something as simple and with no real cost to it, recording of IEPs, was sunk. Why did it sink? Well, misinformation, people saying that parents would record a video of the IEP meeting and clip the video, put embarrassing portions of the video online to embarrass educators. Well, that is not a good reason to deny the rights of parents to be able to understand what's happening in an IEP meeting. But more importantly, and to the point is, the bill said audio recordings. And we had a real struggle making this point. And then were claims that the bill would impose costs on school districts because they'd have to save the recordings. Well, no, the parent is recording the audio. If the district wants its own recording, it can do so. But here's what we know today, and I assume Jana may have spoken about this. We know that attorneys show up at IEP meetings for the districts under all sorts of false guises. They're not supposed to be there. They offer nothing in terms of the educational services for a child to succeed. They're there to protect the district, and they often record the darn meetings. That's wrong. And we need to level the playing field. So I think we'll be back next year with several bills to do this. But let me talk about the really big picture. As you all know, we have an unconscionable and unconstitutional cap on how many children we fund for special education every year. And this year, I thought we were finally going to get rid of it. And it was part of the bill I put together that increases all the funding levers for special education. And we worked with the Superintendent of Public Instruction, school districts, the ARC, PTAs, everyone to put together a very big picture of what is required to truly fund special education in the state of Washington. And that became HB 1310. And the price tag was jaw-dropping for legislators in the middle of a huge deficit, because the price tag is nearly $1 billion a year. And we're facing a deficit that is $11 billion for the 2 years. And we can't fill that hole just with new revenue right away. So adding $1 billion is a big step. But we also have some new revenues that might be dedicated to education. I can talk about that if people want to, but I want to focus on the levers. We have to improve the safety net for high-cost students with disabilities. We have to increase the money for everyone, and we have to get rid of that cap. And we finally made headway. Senator Peterson and Senator Wellman both took my bill, introduced versions of it. 5263 is moving, and it eliminates the cap. And it has a price tag of about $1 billion. And it does include ESIT funding, which pushes it over $1 billion a year. And it's moving, and the Senate has a clear commitment to do this and get rid of this unconscionable cap, whereas in past years, the House has passed legislation to get rid of the cap and the Senate hasn't. This roles bizarrely appear to be reversing, and we need pressure on the House now this year to not only get rid of the cap, but to match the Senate's funding level. That my bill is currently scheduled for executive session. That means a vote in committee tomorrow. It may not happen tomorrow, maybe Friday, but and it may not be a vote on my bill. It may be substituted for a bill with much lower investment and without each of the elements. And so it's going to take a lot of advocacy to say, we need the funding level that's in the Senate bill from Senator Peterson, that $1 billion a year. And we can do it because we have revenues that are dedicated to schools, such as increasing, getting rid of a 1% cap on the state property tax, which is all constitutionally dedicated to education. So that's where our big fight is right now. And I had in my office a superintendent of a small to mid-sized school district from Eastern Washington 2 weeks ago. And she said to me point blank, because of the cap, she directs staff to try to find agreements with parents to do things other than offer an IEP. It means the child is not getting not only the services they need to succeed, but they're also not getting the accountability that comes with an IEP to make sure that they get those services pursuant to a plan. And it was just an upfront, straight up acknowledgement. As long as you put a cap on how many children with disabilities the state will fund, we're not going to serve any children above that cap because we don't get money from the state. And if we don't lift it this year, it's time, I think, for the civil rights lawsuit that we've been waiting for. So I'm going to stop right there.
Hey, Representative Paulette, this is Kyle. Thank you very
Hi,
much.
Kyle.
How's everything going? Well, I mean,
Busy.
I would love the institutional bills because we need something that dedicates, educational bills because we need to be dedicated because I went through being integrated when I was in fourth grade. But the whole thing behind this, and I'm saying about I'm going to go off subject a little bit on the institutional bills for closing Yakima and Rainier. I hopefully that you would be for that to be able to get it off the floor. So, but otherwise, the educational, wish we can all support the educational bills on the K through 12. I mean, especially the difference because even though, yes, it will cost a little over $1 billion, I can think that is one of the things that people need to know because I did it through the 70s, but other people need to know that, hey, we need to make sure that in our system that we can have those supports, but those supports needs the money you need behind that. So that's one big thing that we need to do. Thanks very much, sir, for your time.
Thank you, everyone. And don't hesitate to reach out to me. Thank you. Appreciate what you're all doing.
Yeah, thank you, Representative Paulette.
Thank you for coming. We appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Over to you, Eric.
All right. It's my honor to introduce David Mendez and talking about reducing restraint and eliminating isolation project.
Thank you, Eric, for that introduction. My name is David Mendez. For visual representation, I'm wearing a black t-shirt, black hair, headphones, and a beard, and I identify as Mexican. Thank you so much for inviting me to this space. As I mentioned, I work for an organization called the True Measure Collaborative. I'm an associate director there. Some previous titles that I've held has been a classroom teacher, community organizer, and an instructional coach in the public school systems. I'm also a parent. I'm a father of three beautiful girls, and that's the title that I hold most dearly. I was 10 years old when my cousin she was born with Down syndrome in our family, and Ramona talked earlier about inclusion being a choice, and I just remember as a 10-year-old the choice that our family made around how we were gonna try to be more inclusive and create a sense of inclusion and belonging in our family. And I'm going to talk a little bit more today about the work that we're doing with the OSPI work around reducing restraint and eliminating isolation. And, you know, our district partners, they've made a choice you know, have different practices of professional development to eliminate these harmful practices in school. So just to ground us in what we do at the TMC, the TMC is a nonprofit organization that provides professional development and inclusive practices in schools and districts all across Washington state. Our team pairs training with implementation coaching to build educator capacity to serve all students, including students with disabilities and multilingual learners. We do this work not just with special education teachers. We actually believe that this work needs to be done with every educator across all buildings. We work with classroom educators, including general education teachers, paraeducators, and special education teachers to expand their toolbox of skills to support students' academic and behavioral needs, as well as school and district leadership to improve inclusive education systems at all levels. And we've been honored to participate in OSPI's Reducing Restraint and Eliminating Isolation project as one of several professional development providers. We've been working with 4 of the 16 districts across the state who, like I mentioned, have committed their time, energy, and resources to reducing the use of restraint and eliminating isolation at a systems level. So I wanted to share some of the highlights with you and some of the momentum we're seeing. As Ramona and others mentioned, this practice of isolating and restraining students disproportionately happens with students with disabilities and Black students with disabilities. And so this work is really important to us, and it's important for the partners that we work with as well. Pullman is a partner of ours, Pullman School District. They're a strong partner. We've seen results through the professional development that we've been providing in partnership with them. In the 23-24 school year, Pullman reported 187 incidents of isolation and restraint, and this year they're only reporting 7. So again, this is proof that we can get to a point where with the right instructional professional development and job embedded coaching, we can work towards eliminating isolation and reducing restraint. We've also seen at Pullman students exit their special education placements into less restrictive environments. So you know, there's some schools where they place more restrictions on their students with disabilities, and what we're seeing at Pullman is that they're actually being more inclusive by bringing students into the general education classrooms and into less restrictive environments. Our primary coaching focus with Pullman has been to provide coaching and support during their debriefs following incidents of restraint and isolation. So whenever there's an incident, which has been low this year, we've been able to provide coaching around how they talk about students, right? What their approach is, what happened before the incident occurred, what happened after, so we can get a better understanding of how to avoid these situations altogether. And this has actually improved educator practice on and how they're approaching students during the day, or the triggers that they may be triggering in their own students. That's a big focus of ours. Our focus is not like actually on the incident itself. Our focus is centered around understanding behavior to better serve students. You know, our workshops and coaching sessions are focused on adult behaviors and strategies. So we like to focus so much on what the kid or the child or our student is doing. We like to focus on what the educators are doing. You know, as a former teacher myself and a parent, I know I can trigger behavior in my own kids and students. And so, you know, our work is to support educators in understanding what triggers them so that they can use the right strategy, tool, or approach to a situation and not escalate something that can lead to an incident of isolation or restraint. At Fife Public Schools, another partner of ours, we've seen a 65% reduction of incidents of restraint and isolation. And then Fife has also extended our contract to work with them beyond the scope of the initial project that we have with OSPI. So what that tells me is that they're committed, right, to this work, and they're committed to wanting to learn different approaches and alternative strategies than to want to harm students by isolating and restraining them. Again, our goal for them is to increase the percentage of lessons demonstrating the use of student level and skill assessment data to inform instructional plans. So that has little or nothing to do with the actual incident of restraint and isolation. That has a lot to do with how are our kids engaged, right? How are our students engaged? How are we bringing, creating inclusion and belonging in our schools in the form of instructional plans and strategies? How are we increasing the rigor, right, of our instructional plans so that we don't get to a place where students feel like they're going to be triggered to act or have a behavioral outburst, which can ultimately lead to restraint and isolation. And so so far, our educators and our partners that we've worked with, they've welcomed this approach to how we're supporting them. And this is leading to real results that we're seeing on the ground with the use of restraint and isolation. And again, the use of these practices happens to a very small group of students in comparison to like statewide, right? Like not a lot of like there's a lot of incidents that happen, and they're happening primarily with students with disabilities. And so we want to focus on supporting those districts that are having higher incidents. But this, again, is not like a practice that's happening everywhere, right? It is isolated in particular districts or schools or districts that don't have the resources to try anything different. There is legislation, as Ramona shared, around this work, and what we're hoping at the very least is that we get refunded, the legislator refunds this project so that we can continue the work that we've already started with some of these districts and potentially expand to others who also need the support. So again, thank you all for having me. Thank you for inviting me to this space. And yeah, I'll mute my mic.
Thank you. All right, it's my pleasure to introduce Janet Parker, and telling us why is this bill important on IEP recording?
Hi there. This is Yana Parker, and thank you for having me. I am a middle-aged white woman. I'm wearing glasses. My background is cream curtain, and I have below shoulder length curly red-brown hair. I'm really happy to be here. I was very excited to be reached out to and share, because this is a recording of meetings is a big topic in my personal life as a parent and also as a person with disabilities. I am a parent, I am an advocate, and I am an immigrant. I work with families, not just in my school districts or in my kids' school district. And I also serve on the board of the Seattle Special Education PTSA, which is a district-wide PTSA in Seattle School District. This is my 6th year, and this year I'm the president. And this is how much advocacy has impacted me, and I'm trying to help other families not have to go through what my family had to go through to get my kids IEPs and semi-appropriate services. So I am here to talk about, particularly about recording of meetings and the bill, House Bill 1051. And I put in the chat, I hope it went through, links to the bill. It is a single issue bill that unfortunately died in committee, but I'm being told by different legislators, including Representative Paulette, that this legislature is coming back next year, which is great, but it's also disappointing to see a very good bill die, right? Representative Paulette mentioned he already had bill that included this issue. And so, you know, that this is an interesting one when you look at the legislators on that signed off on that bill. Somehow the legislators from the previous bill aren't on this one, and that was very confusing to me. And I think there was a lot of turmoil in the background behind the scenes that we didn't know about. So I want to start with kind of what this bill supports, and then I want to share quickly some of my experiences. So the House Bill 1051 supports effective parent advocacy because accurate records, help parents understand and engage in educational decisions about their children, right? Notes that are taken during meetings are subjective and often omit crucial details. Recordings provide an objective record to verify what was said and agreed upon among the IEP team or even other educational teams. My hope is that this legislation would get expanded to recordings about all students with disability at the very least, students in public schools, because not every student gets to have an IEP when they should, and that might depend on the recording of the meeting. Recordings support inclusion and accessibility. Parents with disabilities and those who don't speak English or have English as a second language particularly need accurate, accessible records for their children. Students participating in their meetings also need reliable meeting records, right? My son, I have two kids, both had IEPs, both are highly capable, what's called twice exceptional. And for them to participate and have a student voice, it's important to have the recording. And I am able to record meetings in one of our districts. I was denied multiple times in another district where my eldest son attended, and that was greatly delayed his supports and also caused litigation. And then, you know, when an administrator lies in due process to the judge, you have no evidence to show that what actually transpired, right? So that's a really big issue. It reduces, having a recording reduces misunderstandings and disputes because misunderstandings from incomplete notes often lead to unnecessary conflict. Recordings help maintain trust and clarity between families and school teams. It upholds the students' rights in these confidential meetings. The Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA, protects students' privacy, not the teacher's privacy. There is no assumed privacy for public school staff. Conversations about public school students are confidential and protected by FERPA, but they are not private conversations. And the discomfort that we heard during testimonies of that individuals in public service have with a recording that supports the student should not really be more important than the civil rights to meaningful parental participation and therefore the rights of the student. And also, recording protects educators and school teams. We need very accurate documentation of decisions, not only because teachers and educators have very full caseloads, Also, because of staff turnover, there needs to be continuity. There needs to be a record what was decided. We shouldn't be discussing for a year or two one type of support and then go back to square one because there's no accurate record or no record at all about decisions made. There needs to be clarity of meeting agreements between the school district and family, and that serves as a protection for teachers too, right? It's just having that mutual trust and transparency between educators, families, and their students is super important for the outcome of the student. Recording, I actually do record video because I need the visual due to my disabilities, but I also use meeting transcripts that help me search, help me look for things. I still have to correct the transcripts because they're not, Zoom transcripts are not always accurate, but I can go back and, don't have to clarify and then clarify and re-clarify. I can look up things. I don't have to email the school team or don't have to have discussions about what my understanding and their understanding was. It also allows educators, with what we're hearing from educators, it allows them to review and reflect on meetings and improve communication strategies with families and other team members. And then if a team member can't attend a meeting, they can review discussions that took place. And overall, this is a systemic improvement. I will say, piggyback on something that Representative Paulette said, that in my eldest son's school district, where he attended for 3 years, because my husband worked in that school district, not our current school district, we had the district's attorney come to an IEP meeting, and I didn't know she was an attorney. And she introduced herself as wearing many hats in the district and being also HR director. And she was invited because I requested a recording of the meeting. So attorneys are not allowed to come into an IEP meeting unless the parent brings one. And of course, not knowing that she's an attorney, not having a record of it was, it makes it very hard to prove that there was some wrongdoing and violations of my rights under ADA. My PTA has done a lot of advocacy on having recording of meetings and all the other topics, funding and of special education services and restraint and isolation, et cetera, and everything that was mentioned today. I think that there are amendments needed for this particular bill, that the special education process starts long before an IEP is put in place. And this is why parents should be allowed to record any meeting about their children when they suspect they may have a disability. And it's because they may never get the IEP or a 504 plan even, and the support that they require. So allowing parents to record all meetings related to their children attending public schools and their social, emotional, behavioral, academic, and functional needs, including addressing absences. This is especially important for meetings about children with disabilities, whether suspected or identified, and including those with 504 plans and IEPs, or if they have no formal supports in place at all. And then, we also requested amendment with allowing closed captioning and meeting transcripts, which is generally auto-generated and parents can save at the end of the meeting. There's no storage required for the district, which is another issue. And then we ask that the parents are informed that they have the right to record their child's meeting at least a week ahead of the meeting, and then each time procedural safeguards are provided to them. So no less than once a year, as is required by the policy about procedural safeguards. And then Also,
Yana,
yeah.
we're going over time now. So if you could wrap it up, that would be great. Thank you. We so appreciate everything you're saying. So finish up.
Okay. All right. So I'll just say that many families don't succeed in advocating for their disabled children because they are routinely denied meeting recordings or even access to closed captioning transcripts. And so we know how crucial the parental involvement is in student success. So having an accurate record allows parents to effectively advocate for access to free, appropriate public education for their children, because it's too difficult to remember the important exchanges and details and agreements made in meetings, which is particularly important for disabled students, disabled parents, and those with English as a second language, but also for the staff to have a follow through. All right, that's all
Thank
I
you
have.
for your time. That's great. It's my pleasure to introduce Tammy Brown and talking about her personal story. In a moment, she'll speak.
Oh, hello. My name is Tammy Bowen. Sorry about my dog. I'm a white woman with short hair. I I was one of the recipients of the ESET services. I got early services for help with talking and physical therapy, which allowed me to go into mainstream education. I was mainstream right at kindergarten all the way up until high school and graduation. I know we're short in time, so I'll try to hurry. But I have two little stories that are really short. That one it shows how if we don't educate our teachers properly, it can have a negative impact on not only the student that has a disability, but the student that does not have a visual disability interact in a positive manner. A teacher was wanted a student to push me around, but they didn't want to do that. I have friends that wanted to push me around at the recess, but it left a negative impact on bringing the disabled students together with the non-disabled students. So we need to have a more positive training on how to properly teach including with the kids as well as the teachers. And if we have low expectations for kids with disabilities, they're not going to succeed unless they are, strong and determined. I tended to be very determined and very independent, but the reason why we need institutions is at an early age, we create more of a leadership and not kids that are followers, but that are confident, and become successful in their lives. To be to conclude, I was successful. I not only graduated in the mainstream education, but I went on to go to college, get a BA at Western Washington. I worked for a couple of communities. I have a family, and so anyway, that is a little um um
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tammy.
You,
Really do appreciate your personal stories. This is Emily Rogers, and I would just like to welcome again Kathy Marahashi to talk about the bills of interest.
Kathy, you're still on mute. Kathy.
Well, I'm just talking to myself. I know we're running late, so some of you may need to run. So I just put the bill tracker into the chat box. We've talked a lot about the bills today. I think if you go to the bill tracker, you can see where they stand after this. But I think the most important thing I want to tell you is that this week is a really important week. A lot of our bills died last week because they didn't come out of their committee of origin, they say. And they have to get out of what we call the fiscal committee by this Friday. And that's Ways and Means or Senate Ways and Means or House Appropriations. So you need to see if your bill doesn't have, if the bills that you look at have not had a hearing in either of those committees, they're at risk for dying. So you may want to send your legislator a note and say, hey, we need those bills to be heard before Friday. And that's all that's happening this week is House Ways and Means or House Appropriations and Senate Ways and Means are having hearings on the bills that have come to them. And then they not only do they have to have a hearing, but then they have to be what we call exec'd out. They have to move it to the next level to House rules. So I won't go through the specific bills, but there's a lot of them. The other things that are happening right now is we expect to hear from the governor, tomorrow about his budget. We've had a little bit of a preview. The Senate Democrats put out a budget or a document showing what, an all cuts budget would look like. It's pretty scary for people with IDD. I think we're going to need to be really focused on the days ahead to say, protect our services. Because, they're going to have to figure a way to make those happen. And you probably also know that the federal level, last night there was a vote. They talked about for what they call a House resolution to shrink the budget, including Medicaid, greatly. That's not a done deal yet, as far as there's a lot of steps that have to happen. But I think it's important for you to be aware that we need to be doing a lot of advocacy. Next week, Advocacy Day, there's going to be I'll let Sean talk about this a bit, but you can show up in Olympia for the rally next week, and it may be important to do so. And I think we need to start to tell our legislators what we think about the budgets we're seeing. Can you put in the information again about Medicaid Matters? We're also collecting stories that can be used both locally and at the federal level about how Medicaid is important to you. So, please, yeah, there we go. They just put that in the chat box. You can just make a statement, you could send a picture, you could do a video. There's a bunch of things you could do, but this is important. This is a very serious time. And we've got a lot of advocacy to do to protect our services and other things. So, okay, I'm not going to talk anymore because we're way over, and I'll back to Sean.
So next and finally, we have Sean again. Thank you, Sean.
Yeah, so, before I get going, I put, some information about the fail rally into the class. Yes, next week, next Monday at 1 p.m. at the Capitol Desk will be the rally. But we also had a community living advocacy day. Okay, now I'll do my.
This is Sean. Due to time, I put the advocacy tips video in chat today. We heard why education from birth onwards is so important. In the one pager, the summary states, schools need to work for all children. Research shows that when children with disabilities are meaningfully educated alongside their peers and have access to the general education curriculum, they have better outcomes. Inclusive settings set the stage for living a flourishing and meaningful life. We believe all kids with disabilities, whether they are infants and toddlers, preschool age, K through 12 age, or those needing higher education, deserve to have evidence-based supports and access to all programs other students have. We also want to change and prevent any harmful practices that hurt students in schools. We encourage you this week to reach out to your legislators about education and the program and services needed for kids to succeed. I will add again, it's very important to reach out to all of our legislators to educate them about our issues. Sharing your personal stories is one of the best ways for your legislators to get to know what you need. For more information about these and other issues you learned about today, I'm going to post this week's one-pager in the chat. Also, again, please see the ARC's bills of interests. Lastly, I want to encourage you to fill out our Advocacy Day survey. This helps us understand what you like and what you didn't like about Advocacy Day, so we can get better and better. You have the option of filling out the Zoom survey that you should see on the screen now, or alternatively, you can click on the links I posted in the chat. There will be an English and Spanish link. Let us know after if you need any assistance in filling out the survey. With that, I will thank everybody for coming today, especially our great speakers. A few of us will stay for a few minutes after, if people have questions, and remember, change is made by those who show up. Thank you.
Yep. And if you take a minute to fill out the poll, that would be appreciated. Sorry, I didn't get it launched quick enough.
And for those indicated the rally, yeah, it's JOM, Community Representative M. We will be talking a lot about the different aspects of living in the community. So it will be a variety of topics. So, thank you.
Thank you for coming to this great advocacy day. Advocate hard.
Well,